Hi, everybody. I think we're live. Sorry, we're running a minute or two late, but thank you for attending today. Thank you for your attention. I hope that we can make the next hour really informative for you and worthy of your attention. So welcome to Respecting Privacy, Managing Data Collection in Your Business. I'm Lisa Plaggemier, the Executive Director of the National Cybersecurity Alliance, and I'm joined with two great speakers today. Petros Efsatopoulos, if I got that right, Global Head of Research for NortonLifeLock, and John Chen, Vice President, Legal, Intellectual Property, Product, and Privacy from Trend Micro. And we're going to start with a short presentation from Petros, followed by one from John, and then we'll have some open discussion and eventually some audience Q&A. Petros?
Perfect. Yeah. Let me share my screen and hopefully things will show up as they should. Can you see that well?
Yes.
Perfect. So thank you, Lisa and the whole team. Thank you for having us, and thank you for having me. As Lisa said, I'm the head of research at NortonLifeLock. I've been with the research department of NortonLifeLock for many years, and more specifically, I've been working on issues that deal with privacy for at least the last 10 years. So I have a story or two to tell around that. But just to kick off the conversation, I just wanted to share a few insights of a few of the latest insights actually from this year from the Norton Cyber Safety Insights report, which is basically a report we put together after surveying large numbers of consumers, both in the US and elsewhere. Here I'm focusing a little bit more on the results, the US results, but the numbers are pretty similar for the rest of the world. So it turns out, as expected, and especially given the COVID situation, that 73% of Americans spend more time online and working remotely and all of those things that we all got to do in the last couple of years. And but what's interesting is when we surveyed these people, we saw that big numbers of them, specifically 46%, don't know how to deal with a potential identity theft incident. And this is important because identity theft incidents are usually the result of data privacy violations or incidents. And they are very much worried about becoming the victim of a cybercrime incident. But more specifically, the overwhelming majority, 88% of Americans, are concerned about data privacy. So this comes from the fact that it's really hard for the average consumer to understand what's going on behind the scenes and what data goes where and where it resides and what's being done to it and with it, right? And most of them have taken steps to protect or hide their online footprint as a result of this concern. But then again, it's unclear to consumers how effective these steps are. Now, making this a little bit more focused on online activity, another study that we did that, I welcome you to go and check out the full academic publication, it's on our website, showed that, among many other things, it showed that on average, in just 1 week of browsing for your average individual, we encounter, as consumers, we encounter 177 tracking entities. And mind you, this is not 177 trackers. These are tracking entities. In other words, companies that deploy multiple trackers each. So this was kind of an eye-opening observation and measurement, and this is based on real data. So it's not kind of an estimation. This is an actual measurement, and it's also interesting to see that different tracking entities may have different, let's say, areas of interest. So some sensitive categories are especially targeted by certain tracking entities. So some of them prefer to know more about, the political websites you go to, others, legal, financial, religion, and so on. So there is a kind of reason for concern for consumers, and consumers do care about data privacy, and they voice that concern. Similarly, legislators care as well. There's been numerous legislative action and regulatory action worldwide, GDPR, the Privacy Directive, CCPA, and many others that, I'm not a legal expert in this, but I do have to acknowledge that there's been legislative action. And then on the other hand, we see that data breaches are at an all-time high with all the sort of results that they have to businesses. So some interesting things that happened very recently. This is from January 12th. We see that there's more, let's say, aggressive action being taken recently. So the Austrian government had some strong opinions about Google Analytics, which is inherently collecting data, or the fines for breaches of EU privacy laws have spiked to the billions at this point, and this is also very recent from a few days ago. So what are the implications? And this is something that we're going to discuss today, hopefully. So for businesses of all sizes, there are many implications around, their liability concerns when they hold so much sensitive information, reputational threats in case something happens and creates reputational damage to their brand, and obviously a lot of compliance headaches that they have to put up with. But it's not all bad news. There are things that we can do about it, right? So we need to take a moment, all businesses, small and large, take a moment and think about, how we can enforce what I would call the principle of least data. In other words, collect only what's needed and not hoard data. Have clear data processing policies and enforcement of those policies. And then, we have other tools at our disposal, like embrace security best practices to avoid breaches, like strong passwords and two-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication. Enforce and embrace management policies. In many cases, in data breaches, we see that very old data is being stolen. You have the damage from that event, but did that data need to be there in the first place? Maybe we need better retention and deletion policies and so on. And then finally, on the technical front, which is kind of my area of expertise, we are seeing that more and more privacy preserving algorithms and techniques are coming into sort of the scene, such that we can start using them and be more privacy preserving, while at the same time enabling businesses to thrive and not miss out on the insights within the data. So that's kind of a little bit of a conversation starter from me, and I'll pass the mic back to you, Lisa.
Yeah, and before we hear from John, I neglected to give a disclaimer at the beginning of the presentation. I just want to remind people that the information given by the panelists on this call is not meant to be legal advice, and that you should seek legal advice from your own counsel if needed. And with that, I'll turn it over to John.
Great, thanks, Lisa. Okay, well, great to meet everyone. Thanks for having me on this call. Just a little bit of background on myself. As mentioned, I'm head of IP and privacy at Trend Micro. I've been there for quite a few years as well, over 10 years. I started my practice mainly as a IP lawyer, but over the last few years, I've kind of morphed into this position of a privacy lawyer as well, just because there's so many privacy, data privacy law has become probably the most interesting and more talked about area of law recently, just because there's so many new developments in the area of law as well as technology itself. So happy to talk about some of these issues today. So I've got 3 quick slides to go over as a brief introduction. We can go to the next slide. Okay, so this is just an overview of the various privacy laws around the world. In Europe, of course, everyone's probably familiar with GDPR. It's a principle-based legislation that covers European personal data. It's really the high watermark for privacy laws around the world, as more and more countries adopt their own privacy laws. Most are kind of based on the same principles as the GDPR. In the US, we don't have a national privacy law like the GDPR. We have a combination of sector-specific data protection laws like HIPAA and these other laws, as well as state privacy laws. And currently, I'm aware of 3 states that have enacted their own privacy laws: California, Virginia, and Colorado. And so depending on the size of your company and the number of customers you have in those states, you might need to comply with state privacy laws in those states. Okay, next slide, please. So with all these different data privacy laws around the world and in the states, there are common principles to all these privacy laws. The first is data transparency. So all the data privacy laws require entities that are processing personal data to be transparent about what personal data that you're collecting, what do you do with that data, and where that data is stored. Under the GDPR, for example, if you're storing data that's collected from a European resident that's stored outside of Europe, you're going to have to take some compliance steps to legitimize the transfer of the data outside of Europe. And these data transparency questions come up very often from customers. They all want to know if you're collecting data, what you're doing with it, where you're storing it, and so forth. Another common principle is that you have to have a legal basis for collecting personal data, whether it's being collected out of a contractual obligation or opt-in consent. You're going to have a legal basis for collecting that personal data. And then third principle is the most, if not all, privacy laws give individuals the right to access their data, to delete it, to have it corrected, or even to move that personal data if requested. Okay, next slide, please. So this third slide, I just provide a 3 basic compliance to-do lists. These are things that you should consider if you are doing a privacy compliance program. The first is a data mapping exercise, and this is where you go through and get a full understanding of the data that you're collecting, how you're processing that data, where it's being stored, all the questions that you would need to answer for the data transparency requirements from privacy laws. These questions always come up from our customers. All customers want to know, what data you're collecting from me, where it's being stored, how long you're storing it for, do you share it with third parties? So the idea is you want to go through for all the different products and services that you have and have a clear understanding of how the data flows once you're collecting that data from your customers. Second item is that if you don't already have one, you should have a privacy policy. And within that policy, you should have, you can incorporate some of this information that you collect from doing this data mapping exercise. And that will provide the transparency that many of your customers will be asking for. And then lastly, you'll want to set up a data deletion process to satisfy the right of access by individuals to their data. You will receive requests from your customers to delete their data once the business relationship is completed. So you want to have that process in place as well. So that's the some of the items that you should consider. There's probably a lot to unpack here, and so I'm happy to address and answer any questions that you may. Thanks.
Thanks, John. Yeah, we're already getting a lot of requests for the slides. So hopefully those will be available afterwards. If everybody's in agreement, I'm pretty sure because this is a public webinar that there won't be any issue with that. And then this recording will be on our YouTube channel as well. Somebody asked for clarification. When you say you in your presentation, we're talking to you, the small business person. So you, the employer, not the employee. So before we go into any of the other questions, I want to back up a little bit because we've already thrown around a lot of terminology. And Petros, let's start with you. What is it that we exactly mean when we talk about data privacy, and why is this important to a small business? Why does this even matter?
Right. So that's a very interesting question. I often start some of my more technical talks with trying to define privacy. Thankfully, privacy is very difficult to define, but thankfully, data privacy, at least in this context, is a much more narrowly defined term because it has legal meaning and kind of legal interpretation. And I have, as you said earlier, Lisa, I have to put out a disclaimer that I'm not a legal expert in this. Maybe John can chime in as well. But like in practice, when we build systems and services, data privacy refers to a set of processes and rules that control the collection, storage, and sharing of customer data, right? And it's often governed by local regulations, as we mentioned, and in practice it becomes very important when it relates, especially when it relates to sharing of data with third parties. So that's something definitely to consider when third parties get in the picture. Data privacy rules and regulations become very, very much relevant, right? And in most cases, the responsibilities that relate to data privacy apply to all businesses, small and large.
So how does a small business even get started? How can they analyze their data collection practices to get a handle on the status quo for their business? Where do they start?
Yeah, that's also a great question. It's a little bit sometimes of a chicken and egg situation, but data is important for the success of any business, especially nowadays, right? With analytics and all that intelligence going into the business processes. And it's so important that sometimes businesses collect data without necessarily realizing the implications. It's what I mentioned earlier about not applying the principles of like least data or something similar. So in other times, in other situations, we see that businesses may choose to employ third parties to do data collection, and in those cases, sometimes they don't fully understand how the data processing pipeline works. So that's another kind of issue that we see a lot. And this is especially true for small businesses where it's very common to use third-party services and for collection and management of data. So collecting a lot of data can expose the business's to liabilities. So it can lead to reputational damage and all these other implications that I mentioned in my presentation earlier. So it is therefore important to understand exactly what data is needed for the business to thrive. And how that data is collected, whether it's collected by first or third-party services, and also spend some time to put together a policy to understand and analyze the data lifecycle, right? Where is it stored? How is it stored? When and how it's being deleted? What is the lifetime of the data? And of course, if there are any sharing of data, which is always kind of a very tricky subject. So a good place to start is to carefully examine the internal data collection policies and apply this minimalistic approach when possible and collect only what's needed, then carefully examine the data governance policies within the organization and also the data governance policies of any third-party service. For instance, web services that may rely on cookies or other tracking methods to collect data on the users, whether it is their location or their browsing habits or whatever not, like those are the kinds of things that need to be well thought out.
So let's pivot for a little bit and talk about the security situation. We hear about it almost every day in the news from schools and local governments to businesses small and large. We've seen recently how no organization is immune to ransomware attacks and data breaches. Even a small business with a few employees can be victimized. And the effects are often much more devastating than they are for a large enterprise that has a lot more resources. So briefly, what advice would you give for a business with limited resources to prevent a data breach?
Right. So, there are some security best practices that we always advise people to use, and in terms of updating to and patching their systems and so on. But I'm going to take a step back and say that throughout the time, the years, the decades that we've been doing this, humans are still the weakest link. Right, that the biggest bug is not in software, it's in humans, right? So they may click on the wrong thing, they may use a weak password, they may decide to overshare or over-collect data and so on. So we need to be very careful about all the things that I mentioned earlier, the collection of data and the data lifecycle. But then there are these safe practices that I mentioned earlier that are trying to kind of minimize the exposure and the risk related to human error and so on. So for instance, we need to continue encouraging users to embrace security and privacy best practices like multi-factor authentication, strong passwords, maybe use password managers so that you don't have to remember your password and have something a lot stronger. And this goes in both directions, right? Our customers need to have that kind of, they need to be conditioned, enabled, trained to use that kind of, those kinds of tools, but also the business employees and the owners of the business so that they don't expose credentials that are privileged in certain ways. And this type of training, it's essentially behavioral training is really important. So I can give you kind of like a personal example that I've thought about a lot, which is some of the cookie prompts that we get nowadays. They became particularly popular after GDPR got into effect. And sometimes I wonder, like, I like the fact that they're there and they enable consumers to opt out from cookies and things like that. But then sometimes I wonder if we have been behaviorally training people to click accept on anything we prompt, anything that pops up on their screen. So we really need to sit down and think about how we train employees and consumers to do what's best for them.
We've got a couple of questions that have come in, and I'd like to save most of those for the end, but there is one that I wanted to raise right now to both of you. And that's the question, would privacy and retention policies apply to collecting non-sensitive PII, personally identifiable information? For example, general information like location, city or state, general biographic data like gender or race, and usage patterns for a product.
Yeah, I think that a data retention deletion policy across all sorts of data is good to have. You can have, you set different retention policies for different types of data depending on the sensitivity. So for example, you can set maybe a shorter retention policy for personal data and even shorter for sensitive personal data. So when you talk about personal data, there are actually two different levels of personal data. One, under GDPR, there is personal data, which is name, address, phone number, email address, and there's also what's considered sensitive personal data, which relates to one's religion, sex, sexual orientation, those types of more sensitive personal data. Those you can set even shorter retention policies, and for non-personal data, you can set perhaps longer retention policies depending on your business needs. But I think it all has to fit within what you need to keep the data for. You have to have some policy that fits within the reasons why you need to keep that data.
Thanks for that. returning back to the topic of data breaches and staying with you, John, if a business is a victim of a data breach, who do they contact? What do they do?
Yeah, that's a good question. And the first thing you'll want to do before you call, you'll probably want to call a privacy lawyer if you have one. But I think what you want to do, if you encounter or realize that you've suffered a data breach, you have to take steps to not only understand what's happening, but also, investigate into and discover what specific pieces of data have been breached, who the affected individuals are who have been breached, when the breach occurred, and if you took steps to fix that breach, so to stop that breach. And so all these pieces of information are vital to address what you need to do to address that breach. And these are questions that if you do, for example, if you do engage with the privacy lawyer, these are questions that the lawyer will want to know to help you resolve and to comply with any, for example, data breach notification requirements.
Yeah, we like to tell people that they should probably also have a managed security services provider already chosen, so that if something does go wrong, like you said, they can figure out what it is they want wrong and they can stop the incident. And then federal law enforcement is another aspect, making sure you know who your local FBI office is, and knowing these things before something bad happens. We talk about this in our CyberSecure My Business workshop. Just knowing those contacts before something bad happens can be better than trying to figure out who to contact in the heat of the moment, So it is good to think in advance about these things.
Yeah, knowing who the affected individuals are and where they're located will also help you understand what your obligations are.
That'll help your attorney a lot.
That's right.
Probably going to be one of the first questions they ask you.
That's right.
Yeah. We had an interesting question come in, so I'm going to deviate from the script a little bit here, gentlemen, if you'll allow me. With more collaboration tools being used in businesses where a large number of data are stored and owned by different individuals than your organization. In other words, you've got different folks in different departments using different tools to do their jobs. What are your recommendations to ensure data privacy is being adhered to? So I think this is really a question of culture. It's one thing to have policies, but how do you make sure everybody in your business is following those policies or is even aware of them?
Well, I can speak from my personal experiences that it really takes hands-on education across the entire company. And I would say it probably has to start from the top. And so it really requires education and understanding from everyone.
I think the first thing is, even for small businesses, to have written policies, to even have that in writing, and to make sure that your employees are acknowledging those policies on an annual basis. I think those of us who've grown up in large organizations take that for granted, that once a year you're going to have to read all that stuff and sign off on it. But in the world of small and medium-sized businesses, you get so busy with the day-to-day that you forget about things like that, and that's really important to have those kinds of processes in place. And then, as you said, educate people around those policies.
Yeah, and also I wanted to add that especially with collaboration tools, more and more of those tools are services, are third-party services that we sign up for, whether it's Slack or Teams or file sharing or whatever it is, right? So it is important to also understand that third-party services policies and how they handle your data, because a lot of the time they're the ones who are actually storing it, and they're the ones who are actually doing all that for you, right?
Yeah, that's a really good point. If I'm a small business, I'm not writing my own CRM application. I'm using
Exactly.
Salesforce or something else, right? So we talked a little bit about third parties earlier. Do you have any other advice as far as what responsibility businesses have when it comes to the third parties they work with, or how do they evaluate the data practices of those third parties?
So,
Patrick, do you have any ideas? Or John, go ahead.
well, I think it's imperative that whatever third-party vendor partner that you use, you have to make sure that that their privacy practices are in line with yours, because whatever policy that you're going to present to your customers, your vendors and your partners have to be in line with your policies and procedures. So it really is a matter of just making sure that your vendors and your partners' policies and procedures are aligned with yours.
Yeah, and it's also helpful just to have some sort of third-party questionnaire or process that you go through when you're choosing a new vendor to understand, like you said, that their policies are aligned with yours. Sometimes we sign those contracts without even going through any sort of formal purchasing process because we're in a hurry to get something done. And it's important to kind of do your due diligence. We do our due diligence sometimes when it comes to finding the best solution or the best price, but these days you've got to ask about their privacy and security practices as well. That's really important. John, let's talk about some of the privacy regulations that you highlighted in your presentation. Small businesses must also comply with privacy regulations, whether they're state-based like CCPA or international like GDPR, or industry-specific like HIPAA. How can business owners understand what regulations apply to their business, and how can they keep up with the ever-growing number of new laws? So how do they know what is important for them?
Yeah, that's a really good question for a small business. I understand that resources are probably limited. I think it starts out again with a clear understanding of who your customers are, what data you are processing for your customers, so that you have an idea of and where that data is coming from, and so that'll give you an idea of which whether it's a national, whether it's GDPR or state privacy law or HIPAA, that'll give you an idea of which privacy laws you will have to comply with. So an example is if you're doing business in California, you'll have to have an idea of how many customers you have in California or in Colorado, because those state privacy laws are only applicable if you're doing business there and you're of a certain size in terms of revenue, and you're processing a certain number of customers within that state. So it really starts with having a clear understanding of how much data and where that data is coming from that you're processing.
Yeah, we had one question come in about small businesses currently in healthcare, especially it raises an interesting point, because especially during COVID, the number of new companies that have started up, the number of companies offering new solutions, how we treat HIPAA regulation, for example, when we had to pivot to virtual doctor's appointments and checking in for an appointment on my phone, and all the different technology that has sprouted in the last couple of years due to COVID. From an innovation standpoint, it's a lot of it's been great. It's helped us to respond more nimbly to a pandemic. But I think HIPAA kind of got stretched to its limits with all the sort of the urgency of the healthcare situation. So we have one person asking, is there a template, for lack of a better word, for small businesses that are currently in healthcare to use to help them understand their obligations and even the type of data they're collecting and how long they're storing it, those types of things? Are there think we have somebody looking for a little bit of a HIPAA shortcut in this COVID world, working in the healthcare space, and I can empathize with this business. Either of you have any words of advice there?
Well, I don't know of any shortcut, especially for HIPAA, because it's kind of in an area that I'm not too familiar with. But I want to say that the knowing the data and knowing the clientele, as John said, is key. And most importantly, again, I'm not necessarily giving a good shortcut here, but for me, the most important thing that I would love for people to take away from the conversation is that data privacy is something that you need to think about upfront, right? Sometimes we get so caught up in the, okay, let's get things done quickly. I want to get the job done, but you can't like leave regulation and data privacy concerns for later on, right? Even if we achieve that small kind of victory of getting people to have data privacy in kind of one of the early check boxes, shortcut or no shortcut, then that would be definitely a win for their business and for their customers. But unfortunately, I don't know of any HIPAA shortcuts or cheat sheets
Or
here.
templates? Yeah, cheat sheets. John, do you have anything to add?
No, I'm not aware of any template or shortcuts to meet HIPAA compliance. We actually went through a HIPAA compliance exercise just recently at Trend. So I have firsthand knowledge from a large business perspective. I think that the process is probably similar in that it's like compliance with any data protection laws. You have to go through that data mapping exercise to fully understand what data you're collecting. In this case, you want to understand what HIPAA data you're collecting, if any, and you want to follow. If you're intaking that kind of data, you want to follow that data within your system and products and services, and just fully understand where that data is going, where it's being stored, who's processing it, and that will give you an idea of how and where you need to address compliance issues for those kinds of data.
Yeah, I agree. I think data mapping is a really good place to start. We've had some comments on that in the chat. Any type of business, not just when it comes to HIPAA compliance, but that data mapping exercise can be really illuminating, both from a security perspective and from a privacy perspective, because if you don't know what you have or where it is, you can't protect it for security reasons or privacy reasons. We did have one comment come in about a HIPAA compliance checklist from a publication called the HIPAA Journal. And I think we can share that link in the chat, Leah, if you want to do that, if people are interested in looking at that further. Oh, there it is. Thank you. So we found one resource shared by an audience member. And this is a question for you both. What other resources are out there to help small businesses practice good cyber hygiene and data management? We'll share some from the National Cybersecurity Alliance at the end. But do you guys have any resources that you would like to point people to, or just some tips or resources to help small businesses in this area?
Yeah, I think that I think LinkedIn is a great resource. I think there, if you search on LinkedIn, you'll find some free webinars on there. Maybe not specifically for small businesses, but there are a lot of free webinars on data privacy and data protection that you can attend and probably either get some useful information or make some contacts within those types of events. Yeah, that's kind of what popped in my mind.
Petra, anything you can think of?
I would say that from the technology standpoint, there's a lot of resources around security best practices that do apply to data, or either apply to data directly or indirectly, in the sense that you need to proactively kind of reduce your exposure, your what we call, quote unquote, attack surface, such that you minimize the possibility of you becoming sort of a target for whether it is ransomware attacks or another type of attack for that will lead to a data breach and so on. And also, it's really important to keep in mind that you align with your third parties on this, right? A lot of the data breaches that we're seeing do not actually come from the actual employees and leaders of the company that's being breached but a lot of the times the breach happens from a third party that happens to have access in order to provide some service, and the third party gets compromised and so on. So from a security standpoint, there's a lot of resources around best practices. We mentioned a few tools that people should definitely consider using, like, password managers, multi-factor authentications and things like that, so that they can sort of create a more elaborate kind of set of defenses. And those actually are a great start. And then we go into the actual policies for data management, right?
We had some questions come in earlier, 2 or 3, I think, around the topic of aggregated data and or anonymized data, and how the treatment of that data might be different. I know personally, I find the topic of re-identification pretty fascinating. If you Google that, it's amazing what can be done with data that you think is anonymous. How you can back into not making it anonymous anymore. It's a whole industry to itself. But as far as aggregated data treatment, any differences there, or any commentary?
I think it's a very good tool to keep in mind it goes back to understanding what your business needs are, right? If you realize at some point that all you need to understand is some sort of collective measurement, like an aggregate measurement, like what is the average age, or what, I'm just giving a random example here off the top of my head. It's a very good step to reduce sort of exposure and liability if you can do that. And there are algorithms and ways to do it. And maybe this is one of the things that you could look into when you hire a third party, whether they can provide aggregated data rather than raw data, or reducted data in some sense. So anonymization, as you said, is tricky. It has to be done the right way. There is a right way to do it. There's also the concept of pseudonymization, which is reversible, and that's more kind of special and for more like niche operations. But using kind of grouping data and kind of summarizing it and removing sensitive information from that, or information that can be traced to an individual, is definitely one of the practices that people should consider, or look for third parties that can do that.
Yeah, I don't consider aggregated data to be personal data. So I consider that to be a separate category of data. So I would not consider aggregated data to be within the scope of these privacy laws. So I think if you're, it's keeping aggregated data is better than keeping personal data. Now, as far as anonymized data, I think what Petros mentioned, anonymizing data is not that simple, right? I mean, I think a lot of privacy experts feel that it's not practical to try and fully anonymize personal data, just because of the technical difficulties in doing that. I think most companies will just pseudonymize it, which is really either hashing or encrypting that data, which is probably the most that most companies can expect to do to protect that personal data, right? Encrypting or hashing is the most you could do from a practical standpoint.
So I'm going to ask you guys to look in your crystal balls for a few minutes. a little bit of chatter in the Q&A about national data protection laws, some sort of regulation in the US at the national level, as opposed to the state-by-state approach that we have happening right now. Any thoughts on why we're not there yet? First question: what have the roadblocks been to getting some sort of national regulation, and what's your outlook? What's your prediction for when or if that'll happen in the US? Who wants to go first? That's a doozy.
It's a loaded question. I think eventually it will happen. I mean, it will happen. I'm sure everyone's got their opinions about why it hasn't happened so far, but eventually we will have one. I can only, expect that it's going to be somewhat, under the same principles and in line with GDPR, because I still think that GDPR is just a high watermark for privacy legislations. And anything that's so, misaligned with GDPR will just create havoc for everyone, right? And we've got to
makes it difficult to comply when there's so
sure,
much.
yes, right. So it's got to be in line with GDPR and everybody else. So that's kind of my expectation.
My view is similar. I think it will happen. I mean, there are jurisdictional hurdles and other sort of considerations around that. It's kind of a similar question as to why we don't have like a national digital vaccine certificate, for instance, right? It's kind of along the same lines, but one might say that that will happen as well. So I think one of the drivers for this type of legislation, among other things, is that as we move forward and we start embracing more and more of, digital transactions, digital identity, and those things become mainstream. And I know that there's legislative interest to create a digital identity, national sort of digital identity, as well as local digital identities. Then at that point, you do have to also deal with the whole data privacy issue. So if not for something else, if not for another reason, whether it is like that other reason being, aligned with GDPR or some other reason, at least when we reach the point of embracing digital identity, then, that's kind of like the last frontier where we would need to definitely create something of a national data privacy legislation, in my opinion.
I'll chime in as well. I think that one of the barriers has been just literacy, cyber literacy, understanding, education on these issues from the American public and legislators. If we, if you think back to the 70s, I'm a child of the 70s. And I was living in Detroit, and my dad was in the auto industry, and there was a lot of regulation coming around seatbelts and airbags and all that good stuff. That's a very real thing. You can look at the data and see how many people die in traffic accidents every year, and see the difference when the industry was regulated to use seatbelts and then passive restraints like airbags. It's very tangible, right? Those are human lives. Traffic accidents are, very tangible, visible things. And when it comes to our data and cybersecurity and privacy, it's intangible and it's complex. Not all of us are technical. Some people are more technical than others and grasp these issues very quickly, and other people don't get it. And it's hard. It can be hard to educate yourself if you don't speak techie like a lot of folks. So I think, that's really, really important to our mission at the National Cybersecurity Alliance, that we make these things easier for people to understand. Education is core to our mission. And I think the more we understand, democracy works best when you have a very educated populace on a particular topic. And so with events like this one, we're hoping to close that gap. And so I would say to the people that have tuned in today, you're already a part of the solution, because you understand enough to join us and to learn more about these things. And so that's really, really important, is just educating yourself. I think that's a really good first step. Let's see, do we have any other questions that have come in lately? Any other? We have about 7 minutes left. Petros, anything that we haven't covered today that you'd like to draw attention to or give people advice?
Yeah, so one comment I would make in support of what you just said about education is something that I mentioned sometimes. I think I've mentioned it to you, Lisa, in one of our previous conversations, is that in the cyber world, it's very difficult to perceive threat, danger, something unsafe, and so on. In the physical world, we know how to understand that. We've been conditioned socially and even like even as a species, like I would go in a very deep way. Like we know, like when we see a dark alley, we know not to go there, you know, at night. In the cyber world, that's not true. We haven't developed those instincts yet.
Right.
So in that sense, it's very difficult to have expectations from users. We can't really expect that they would be able to kind of intuitively understand what's best for them, or what to do or what not to do, where to go or where not to go. And therefore, education is key, and kind of enablement is key, like being able to sort of enable the consumers and enable the community to make better decisions, right? And when that cannot happen for whatever reason, or because it takes a lot of time or whatever not, then maybe those gaps need to be sort of addressed by some sort of safety net regulation, whether it's GDPR or something like that. So it's a very deep problem that also has to do with the human nature and human psychology.
John, anything that we haven't touched on that you haven't said that you'd like to say before we close today? You're on mute.
Sorry. I don't think so. I think I would just like to reiterate from a small business owner's perspective, the importance of not only education, but also just fully understanding the data flows that you're intaking from your customers. I think that's really the first step that all business owners should take to address data privacy concerns and obligations and compliance, is to fully understand what data you're collecting, what you're doing with it. Do you really need it? How long you store it for, and so forth. And also just general education about cybersecurity itself.
Yep, map your data. That's a great place to start.
Yeah.
Jen, do we have some tips on a slide that we want to share to close out? So I want to thank everybody for joining us today. And just to wrap up, we have lots of information on StaySafeOnline.org to help both individuals and small businesses. As John mentioned, having a better understanding of what you're collecting, so conducting some sort of a privacy assessment, adopt a privacy framework, and educate your employees. The education piece is very important when it comes to security and privacy both. So we just want to leave you with those tips today. And you can find more on our website, StaySafeOnline.org. I want to thank you all for joining us today. And I particularly want to thank John and Petros for all their words of insight and advice on this very important topic.
Thank you very much for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yep, thank you.